In the bitter winter of 1944, deep in the frozen forests of Belgium, a small group of American soldiers found themselves surrounded by one of the largest German offensives of World War II, cut off from supplies, outnumbered by enemy forces, and facing temperatures so cold that weapons froze in the hands of the men who carried them, yet despite every advantage being stacked against them, they did something that would echo through military history for generations to come, because this was not just a story about survival, and it was not simply another chapter in the brutal winter fighting of the European theater. This was the story of resolve under pressure, of ordinary American soldiers who refused to give ground when the moment demanded everything they had. And if you enjoy powerful true stories of courage like this one, make sure to like the video and subscribe to Voices Across History, because we bring these forgotten moments of heroism back to life. By December of 1944, many Allied leaders believed the war in Europe was entering its final phase. German forces had been pushed back across France after the Normandy landings, and there was a growing sense among some commanders that the enemy no longer had the strength to launch a major counteroffensive. But inside Nazi Germany, Adolf Hitler was preparing one last desperate gamble, a massive surprise attack through the dense Ardennes forest designed to split Allied lines, capture the vital port of Antwerp, and force the Western Allies into negotiating peace. And the plan depended entirely on speed, shock, and the belief that American forces in the region were thin, tired, and unprepared for what was about to hit them. The Ardennes sector was considered relatively quiet compared to other parts of the front, which is exactly why many American units rotating into the area believed they were moving into a rest sector rather than a coming storm. The forests were thick, the roads were narrow, and the rolling hills were already beginning to freeze under the early winter conditions. But beneath that calm surface, German armored divisions were quietly assembling for what would become known as the Battle of the Bulge. The largest and bloodiest battle fought by the United States Army during the entire war in Europe. When the attack finally came on the morning of December 16, 1944, it hit with overwhelming force. More than 200,000 German troops supported by tanks and heavy artillery slammed into the thin American lines, creating confusion, breaking communications, and punching deep into Allied territory. And in the chaos of those first critical days, small American units across the region suddenly found themselves isolated, cut off from higher command, and forced to make life-or-death decisions with very little information about what was happening beyond their immediate surroundings. And among those units were 77 American soldiers whose stand would become one of the most quietly remarkable moments of the entire campaign. These men were not famous generals, and they were not part of a massive armored formation. They were infantrymen, the backbone of the American army, young, cold, exhausted, and now staring into a situation that was rapidly deteriorating around them as German forces pushed forward through the snow-covered terrain. And what made their situation even more dangerous was the simple reality of winter warfare. Because in the Ardennes that December, the cold was not just uncomfortable, it was a weapon. All by itself, temperatures dropped well below freezing, snow clogged movement, medical evacuation became nearly impossible in many areas, and frostbite began claiming casualties almost as efficiently as enemy fire. As German units advanced, road junctions and small towns became critically important, because whoever controlled the crossroads controlled the movement of reinforcements, armor, and supplies. And one of the most strategically vital locations in the region was the small Belgian town of Bastogne, a seemingly modest place that sat at the center of 7 major roads, making it a logistical prize that both sides understood could influence the entire battle. And very quickly, the fight for Bastogne began to intensify as American forces rushed to hold the town against the rapidly advancing German spearheads. What unfolded over the following days would become one of the defining moments of American military history, because while large formations maneuvered across the Ardennes, smaller groups of soldiers were fighting desperate holding actions in forests, villages, and frozen fields, buying precious time minute by minute, hour by hour. And among them were the 77 men whose story we are about to follow, men who would soon discover that the line they were ordered to hold was about to become one of the most dangerous places in the entire European theater. And as the snow continued to fall and German pressure mounted, these soldiers began to realize a hard truth that every infantryman throughout history eventually faces: sometimes there is no immediate rescue coming, sometimes the radio goes quiet, sometimes the horizon fills with enemy movement, and in those moments, history turns not on grand strategies or famous speeches, but on whether a small group of determined soldiers decides to stand their ground or give it up. In the next part of this story, the situation around Bastogne will tighten, the weather will worsen, and the 77 Americans will receive the kind of orders that leave no room for misunderstanding, because what was coming toward them through the Ardennes forest was far larger than anyone on their line initially realized. If you're enjoying this story so far, take a second to like the video, subscribe to Voices Across History, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from, because in part 2, the trap begins to close. By the evening of December 17, 1944, the situation across the Ardennes had shifted from uneasy confusion to full-blown crisis, and for many American units on the ground, the war they thought was winding down had suddenly roared back to life with terrifying speed, because German armored columns were now pushing through gaps in the Allied lines, bypassing strongpoints, cutting telephone wires, and spreading the kind of battlefield uncertainty that can be more dangerous than the enemy itself, and in the freezing woods near Bastogne, the 77 American soldiers at the center of our story were beginning to understand that they were no longer positioned on a quiet defensive line but directly in the path of a major offensive that was still building momentum with every passing hour. The men had already been dealing with the brutal realities of winter in the Ardennes, where the cold seeped through boots and gloves no matter how tightly they were wrapped, where breath froze in the air during night watches, and where even simple tasks like maintaining weapons required constant attention to prevent mechanical failure in the sub-zero temperatures. But now the environmental hardship was being compounded by something far more dangerous, the growing realization that German forces were not only advancing nearby but were doing so in strength, and worse, in coordination that suggested this was no local probe or limited attack, but something much larger and far more deliberate. Reports filtering back through fragmented communications painted a troubling picture. German units were moving fast, faster than many Allied planners had expected possible in the dense Ardennes terrain, and spearheaded by experienced panzer divisions, they were exploiting weak points and driving west with the clear objective of creating a deep bulge in the Allied front line, which is exactly how the battle would later earn its name. And as commanders scrambled to piece together what was happening, small American detachments like the Group of 77 found themselves in a dangerous kind of battlefield limbo, still holding assigned positions but increasingly aware that the larger strategic picture was deteriorating around them. What made their situation especially precarious was geography, because the road networks feeding into Bastogne were rapidly becoming contested arteries of movement, and control of even minor crossroads could determine whether reinforcements arrived in time or whether advancing German units were able to isolate American defenders piece by piece, and for the men on the ground, the map lines and operational arrows discussed at higher headquarters translated into something far more immediate and personal, the distant rumble of armor, the sudden appearance of enemy patrols where none had been seen days earlier, and the growing frequency of artillery fire probing American positions. Inside the American lines, uncertainty bred tension, and tension sharpened every sound in the winter woods, because in cold weather warfare, visibility is often reduced, movement is slowed, and the element of surprise becomes even more deadly than usual, and the soldiers holding their positions began to notice signs that the front was no longer stable, refugee civilians moving west along frozen roads, scattered units passing through with hurried warnings, and the unmistakable thunder of heavy vehicles somewhere beyond the tree line, each new clue adding to the uneasy picture forming in their minds. Despite the growing danger, orders remained clear and consistent: hold the line, maintain position, delay the enemy wherever possible, because at that stage of the battle, time itself had become one of the most valuable commodities on the entire Western Front. Every hour that forward units could slow the German advance gave higher command more opportunity to move reserves, reorganize defensive lines, and prepare the response that would eventually blunt the offensive. But for the 77 men in the freezing Ardennes, that larger strategic purpose offered little immediate comfort as their local situation continued to grow more precarious. As darkness settled over the snow-covered landscape on the night of December 17, the temperature dropped even further, and with it came the kind of stillness that experienced soldiers learned to distrust, because winter nights on the front often carry sound farther than expected, and in that silence, the men began to pick up distant mechanical noises, the grinding movement of tracked vehicles somewhere beyond their immediate sector, a sign that German armored elements were probing deeper into areas that had been considered relatively secure only days before. Sleep came in short, uncomfortable stretches, if it came at all, because the cold made rest difficult and the situation made it risky, and through the long night watches, the soldiers maintained their defensive posture, checking fields of fire, monitoring approaches, and doing the quiet, disciplined work that infantry units throughout history have performed in moments when the outcome of much larger operations quietly depends on whether small groups of men remain steady under pressure. By the early hours of December 18, scattered intelligence reports began confirming what many on the ground already suspected: German forces were attempting to encircle key positions in the Bastogne sector, and units across the region were at increasing risk of being cut off from supply and reinforcement routes, a development that transformed the tactical picture almost instantly. Because defending a position with secure lines behind you is one thing, but holding ground while the enemy moves to surround you is an entirely different level of danger. For the 77 Americans in our story, the moment of clarity came not through a dramatic announcement but through the slow accumulation of battlefield reality. Friendly units were becoming harder to contact, movement along nearby roads was becoming more hazardous, and enemy activity was steadily increasing in both frequency and confidence. All signs that the situation was tightening in ways that would soon force difficult decisions from commanders at every level. Yet even as the pressure mounted, the fundamental mission did not change: hold, delay, and buy time, because in the opening phase of the Battle of the Bulge, time was exactly what the American High Command needed most, and unknowingly, the 77 men dug into their frozen positions were already playing a role far larger than their numbers would suggest. In the next part of this story, the German advance will close in, the weather will turn even more brutal, and the 77 soldiers will receive confirmation of what many of them are already beginning to suspect, that the road behind them is no longer secure, and the line they are holding is about to become a trap. If you're still with us, make sure to like the video, subscribe to Voices Across History, and tell me in the comments which historical battle we should cover next, because in part 3, the isolation becomes real. By December 18, 1944, the illusion of a stable front in the Ardennes had completely shattered, and for American units scattered across the sector, the war had suddenly transformed into a dangerous game of survival and delay, because German armored columns were no longer just probing the line, they were pushing deep, fast, and with a level of coordination that made one thing painfully clear to the men on the ground: this was a full-scale offensive designed to break through by speed and shock, before Allied command could properly respond. In the freezing approaches near Bastogne, the 77 American soldiers at the center of our story were now operating under conditions that infantry throughout history have come to recognize as the beginning of encirclement. Communications were becoming unreliable, neighboring units were harder to reach, and the distant sounds of battle were no longer confined to a single direction but seemed to echo from multiple points across the winter landscape. The weather, already harsh, began to tighten its grip on the battlefield, because the Ardennes winter of 1944 was not merely cold, it was punishingly unforgiving. Temperatures plunged well below freezing during the night, snow accumulated in drifts that slowed vehicle movement and muffled sound, and the low cloud ceiling grounded much of the Allied air support that would normally have provided a critical advantage. And this combination of environmental pressure and enemy momentum created exactly the conditions German planners had hoped for when they launched their surprise offensive. For the American infantry holding exposed positions, the cold seeped into every piece of equipment. Rifle bolts required constant attention, machine gun crews had to fight both the enemy and the freezing mechanisms of their own weapons, and even basic tasks like digging deeper fighting positions became exhausting work in the hardened winter ground. Sometime during the morning hours, fragmented reports finally confirmed what many of the 77 soldiers had already begun to suspect through observation and instinct: German forces were moving around the flanks of multiple American positions in the Bastogne sector, not just pressing forward but attempting to isolate and compress the defensive perimeter. And that realization changed the psychological weight of the mission almost instantly, because holding a line while friendly territory lies safely behind you is one thing, but maintaining that same position while the enemy works to close the roads to your rear is an entirely different level of commitment. Still, the orders remained firm and unmistakable: hold your ground, delay the enemy, buy time, because at that moment in the battle, every hour mattered more than every mile. Throughout the day, enemy activity increased in both frequency and boldness. small German reconnaissance elements probed forward through the tree lines, artillery began walking closer to American positions, and the distant rumble of armored movement became more consistent, not constant yet, but steady enough to remove any lingering doubt about the scale of the offensive that was unfolding across the Ardennes. The 77 Americans adjusted the only way infantry can under growing pressure. They improved fields of fire, redistributed ammunition where possible, checked communications equipment repeatedly, and settled into the tense rhythm of defensive readiness that becomes second nature to seasoned ground troops operating in uncertain conditions. What made their situation especially dangerous was the simple arithmetic of manpower and supply, because unlike larger formations with layered defenses and dedicated logistics, small isolated groups depended heavily on the stability of the broader front line, and as German units continued to exploit gaps and push west, the margin for error grew thinner by the hour. Ammunition expenditure had to be watched carefully. Every burst from a machine gun and every rifle volley was weighed against the uncomfortable reality that resupply in those conditions was far from guaranteed, and the cold only made matters worse, draining energy, stiffening fingers, and turning long hours in exposed positions into a physical test of endurance as much as a tactical challenge. By late afternoon, the sky over the Ardennes remained locked under heavy cloud cover, denying Allied aircraft the clear visibility they needed to operate effectively, and that absence was deeply felt by the men on the ground, because American forces had grown accustomed to the overwhelming support of their air power throughout much of the campaign in Western Europe. Now, with the skies closed and the enemy advancing under cover of weather, the fight had returned to its most fundamental form, infantry holding ground with whatever support was immediately available, relying on discipline, positioning, and determination to offset the growing numerical pressure building beyond the tree line. As evening approached, new intelligence reached forward elements near Bastogne that confirmed the operational picture in stark terms. German forces were successfully creating what commanders feared most, a developing bulge in the Allied front that threatened to isolate key road hubs and defensive strongpoints, and among those critical locations was Bastogne, whose network of converging roads made it far more important than its small size might suggest. Units across the sector were being warned to prepare for potential encirclement scenarios, and while the 77 soldiers did not yet know the full scale of the danger, the tightening pattern of enemy movement was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. Night fell early and hard in the winter Ardennes, and with darkness came the heightened tension that every frontline soldier recognizes, because visibility dropped, sound carried unpredictably across the frozen terrain, and the possibility of sudden enemy contact increased with every passing hour. The men rotated through watch positions, scanning the tree lines, listening for movement, and maintaining the quiet discipline that had already kept them steady through the first shock of the German offensive, but beneath that professionalism, the reality was beginning to settle in. The front was no longer fluid, it was constricting. Somewhere beyond their immediate sector, German commanders were continuing to push forward elements west in hopes of maintaining the momentum of the offensive, and the pressure on Bastogne was increasing by the hour, though the full weight of what was coming had not yet reached the 77 Americans holding their frozen stretch of ground. What they did know was simple and undeniable: friendly lines were becoming harder to track, enemy presence was growing, and the cold winter night ahead was unlikely to bring relief. In Part 4, the situation will cross the point of no return. The roads around Bastogne will begin to close, and the 77 soldiers will finally receive confirmation that the fight they are in is no longer just a defensive stand, but a race against encirclement that will test every ounce of their endurance and resolve. If you're locked into this story, take a moment to like the video, subscribe to Voices Across History, and drop a comment telling me which country you're watching from, because in the next chapter, the trap tightens for real. By December 19, 1944, the battlefield reality around Bastogne had crossed a critical threshold, and for American forces scattered across the Ardennes, the fight was no longer about simply holding defensive lines but about surviving an increasingly coordinated effort by German commanders to surround and isolate key positions before Allied reserves could fully respond. For the 77 American soldiers dug into their frozen sector, the shift was felt not through a single dramatic announcement but through the steady accumulation of unmistakable signs. Friendly traffic along nearby roads had thinned dramatically, radio traffic carried a sharper urgency, and enemy patrols were appearing in areas that only days earlier had been considered safely behind the forward edge of the battle area. The German plan, ambitious and risky from the beginning, depended heavily on speed, and in the early days of the offensive that speed had produced real gains. Armored spearheads had driven westward through weak points in the Allied line, creating confusion and forcing American commanders to rapidly reposition units to contain the penetration. And at the center of that developing crisis sat the small but critically important road hub of Bastogne, whose network of 7 converging roads made it one of the most valuable pieces of ground in the entire Ardennes sector. Whoever controlled Bastogne could influence the movement of reinforcements, fuel, and armored columns across a wide portion of the front, and both sides understood the stakes with absolute clarity. For the men holding forward positions around the Bastogne perimeter, including the 77 at the heart of this story, the operational map translated into something far more immediate and personal: increasing artillery pressure, more frequent probing attacks, and the growing awareness that German units were attempting to slip around the flanks rather than simply smash head-on through every defended position. This was classic maneuver warfare, and it created exactly the kind of dangerous uncertainty that small isolated units are most vulnerable to, because even if their immediate front remained quiet for a few hours, the situation to their rear could be changing rapidly. The weather continued to favor the German timetable. Low cloud ceilings and persistent winter conditions kept much of the Allied air power grounded, denying American forces one of their most significant advantages, and on the frozen ground, the cold showed no mercy to either side. Weapons required constant maintenance, exposed skin risked frostbite within minutes during night watches, and the simple act of staying alert for long hours in subzero temperatures became an exhausting physical trial layered on top of the growing tactical danger. Sometime during the afternoon, the 77 soldiers finally received the kind of update that removes any remaining doubt from a battlefield situation. German forces had successfully pushed deep enough into the Ardennes that multiple American units in the Bastogne region were now at serious risk of encirclement, and higher command was ordering all forward elements to prepare for the possibility of fighting while cut off from normal supply routes. It was not phrased dramatically, and it did not need to be, because every experienced infantryman understands exactly what those words imply. Ammunition would have to be conserved carefully, medical evacuation might become impossible, and any ground already held would have to be defended with whatever resources were immediately available. Despite the mounting pressure, discipline held firm along the American positions, fields of fire were checked and rechecked, overlapping coverage was adjusted where possible, and the quiet professionalism of trained infantry units began to show its value. Because while large armored movements often dominate the headlines of major battles, history repeatedly demonstrates that the outcome of critical moments frequently depends on whether small groups of determined soldiers maintain their composure when the larger situation begins to deteriorate around them. As daylight faded on December 19, the distant sounds of battle grew heavier to the east and northeast, not constant yet, but more frequent than the days before, and through the frozen woods came the unmistakable indicators of increased German activity: engines, intermittent artillery flashes on the horizon, and occasional bursts of small arms fire echoing across the snow-covered terrain. The 77 Americans remained in position, fully aware now that the operational picture had shifted into something far more dangerous than the quiet sector many of them believed they had rotated into only days earlier. Night brought no relief, and in some ways it made the situation even more tense, because winter darkness in the Ardennes created the perfect environment for infiltration and surprise movement, and both sides understood it. Listening posts strained to detect movement beyond the tree lines, sentries rotated carefully to avoid fatigue in the extreme cold, and every man in the defensive line knew that if German units succeeded in fully closing the ring around Bastogne, the fight ahead would become a test not just of firepower but of endurance under isolation. Somewhere to the south and west, American commanders were already working urgently to move reinforcements toward the threatened sector, including elements of the 101st Airborne Division, whose rapid deployment would soon become one of the defining responses to the German offensive. But for the 77 men holding their frozen stretch of ground, those larger movements were still distant developments unfolding beyond their immediate horizon, and on their line, the mission remained exactly what it had become since the offensive began: hold, delay, and do not give ground unless ordered. By the early hours of December 20, the situation was approaching the point where speculation would give way to certainty. The roads into Bastogne were becoming increasingly contested, German pressure was building from multiple directions, and the 77 soldiers were about to enter the most dangerous phase of their stand, the moment when isolation stops being a possibility and starts becoming reality. In Part 5, the ring around Bastogne will begin to close, supply shortages will become a real concern, and the 77 Americans will face the kind of decision that has defined battlefield courage for generations. If you're still following this incredible true story, take a moment to like the video, subscribe to Voices Across History, and drop a comment with the word "hold" if you would have stayed on the line, because in the next chapter, the pressure becomes relentless. By December 20, 1944, the battlefield around Bastogne had hardened into one of the most dangerous situations American forces had faced in Western Europe since the Normandy breakout, and for the 77 soldiers holding their frozen defensive sector, the slow tightening of the German offensive was no longer theoretical or based on scattered reports. It was now visible in the changing rhythm of the fight itself. Enemy artillery began falling with greater consistency, probing attacks became more deliberate, and most concerning of all, movement along the roads behind American positions had grown noticeably thinner, a subtle but deeply troubling indicator that the operational noose around Bastogne was beginning to draw tight. The German objective remained clear: isolate Bastogne, capture the vital road network, and maintain the westward momentum of the offensive long enough to fracture Allied coordination across the region, and while the larger armored thrusts grabbed attention on operational maps, success depended just as heavily on compressing and neutralizing smaller American strongpoints that could disrupt movement and delay the timetable. That reality placed enormous importance on small defensive elements like the 77 infantrymen now dug into the frozen ground, because every hour they continued to hold their assigned sector complicated German movement and bought precious time for the Allied response that was still building beyond the horizon. The cold, already punishing, grew even more dangerous as the days passed, because winter warfare in the Ardennes was a battle of endurance layered on top of combat itself. Weapons had to be cycled and checked constantly to prevent freezing, fingers numbed inside gloves that never seemed warm enough, and the simple act of remaining alert during long watches in sub-zero temperatures drained energy at an alarming rate. Frostbite cases were beginning to appear across the wider Bastogne perimeter, and while the 77 men remained operational, every soldier understood that the environment was becoming as much an adversary as the enemy pressing forward through the forests. Ammunition discipline became increasingly important as resupply routes grew more uncertain, because once units are threatened with encirclement, every round fired must be weighed carefully against the unknown duration of the fight ahead. Machine gun teams monitored their belts closely, riflemen conserved fire unless targets were clearly identified, and leadership within the small American position emphasized controlled engagement rather than wasteful bursts of fire that could leave them vulnerable later. This quiet shift in mindset is one of the earliest signs that experienced troops recognized the possibility of isolation, and by this stage of the Battle of the Bulge, the men holding the line near Bastogne were adjusting exactly as doctrine and hard-earned battlefield instinct demanded. Throughout the day, the tempo of German activity continued to build, reconnaissance elements pushed closer to American positions, artillery registration became more accurate, and the distant mechanical rumble of armored movement could be heard with increasing frequency beyond the tree lines. It was not yet a full assault on their specific position, but the pattern was unmistakable: the offensive was still unfolding, still building pressure, and still searching for weak points it could exploit to accelerate the encirclement of the Bastogne sector. Meanwhile, inside the growing defensive pocket, American commanders were working urgently to stabilize the situation, and among the most significant developments was the rapid arrival of elements from the 101st Airborne Division, whose movement toward Bastogne would soon become one of the defining moments of the entire campaign. But reinforcement at the operational level did not immediately change the tactical reality facing small forward detachments, because until the perimeter fully solidified and supply lines were re-established, every exposed unit remained at risk of being overwhelmed if German pressure intensified in the wrong place at the wrong time. As afternoon faded into another brutally cold evening, the 77 soldiers maintained their positions with the steady discipline that had carried them through the previous days of uncertainty. Fields of fire remained carefully aligned, listening posts stayed alert through the deepening darkness, and the men settled into the tense rhythm that often precedes major contact, that uneasy balance between waiting and knowing that waiting cannot last forever. The forest around them had grown quieter in some ways, but more ominous in others, because experienced infantry understand that an enemy preparing for larger movement often reduces small, careless noise. By nightfall, reports filtering through the Bastogne sector confirmed what many on the ground were already feeling in their bones: German forces had succeeded in surrounding much of the town and its defensive positions, creating the encirclement that commanders had feared since the offensive first erupted days earlier. The roads were increasingly dangerous, supply convoys faced heavy risk, and for units already in exposed positions, the reality of fighting while cut off was no longer hypothetical. For the 77 Americans holding their frozen stretch of ground, the mission did not change, but the stakes did. What had begun as a defensive holding action was now becoming a test of endurance under isolation, and every man in that position understood the unspoken truth of the moment: relief might come, but it would not come quickly, and until it did, the line in front of them was theirs to hold. In Part 6, the pressure will reach its peak. German forces will probe harder against the Bastogne perimeter, and the 77 soldiers will face the moment that defines every great defensive stand, the point where holding the line becomes a matter not just of orders, but of sheer determination. If this story has you locked in, take a second to like the video, subscribe to Voices Across History, and drop a comment saying, "Stand fast," if you respect what these men were facing, because in the next chapter, the fight reaches its most dangerous hour. By December 21, 1944, the situation around Bastogne had reached its most dangerous phase, and for the 77 American soldiers holding their frozen defensive sector, the uncertainty of the previous days had hardened into a clear and unavoidable reality. They were now fighting inside an encircled battlefield where every decision carried heavier consequences and every hour of resistance mattered more than ever. The German offensive, which had erupted with shocking speed just days earlier, was now pressing from multiple directions, and while the Bastogne perimeter had not collapsed, it was under constant and increasing pressure from forces determined to break the American hold on the critical road hub. Inside the defensive lines, the effects of isolation were beginning to accumulate in quiet but meaningful ways. Ammunition remained available but was being watched carefully. Medical evacuation had become extremely limited due to enemy activity along the surrounding roads, and the bitter Ardennes winter continued to drain energy from every man exposed to it. Frost clung to equipment, breath crystallized in the freezing air during long night watches, and the simple act of staying alert required a level of physical endurance that few outside the infantry truly understand. Yet despite these mounting challenges, the 77 soldiers maintained their positions with the same steady discipline that had carried them through the opening shock of the German assault. German commanders, fully aware of Bastogne's importance, intensified their efforts to compress the American perimeter. Artillery fire became more deliberate and better adjusted, probing attacks tested weak points, and reconnaissance elements pushed closer in an attempt to identify sectors that might be vulnerable to a more decisive strike. For the men on the line, the pattern was unmistakable: the enemy was feeling out the defenses, searching for an opening, and preparing for the possibility of forcing a breakthrough if one presented itself. In moments like this, history has shown that small units often become the hinge on which much larger outcomes can turn, and the 77 Americans were now squarely in that kind of moment. Throughout the day, the cold remained relentless. The Ardennes winter showed no sign of easing, and the heavy cloud cover continued to limit Allied air operations, one of the key factors that had allowed the German offensive to achieve its early momentum. Without consistent air support overhead, the fight around Bastogne remained largely a ground struggle, infantry and artillery trading pressure across snow-covered terrain where visibility was limited and movement was slow. Every advantage had to be earned the hard way, through positioning, coordination, and the simple but demanding requirement of staying steady under stress. Sometime during this tense period came one of the most famous moments associated with the defense of Bastogne. German forces, confident in their encirclement, delivered a surrender demand to the American defenders, expecting that the combination of isolation, winter conditions, and mounting pressure might force a capitulation. The response from the acting American commander, Anthony McAuliffe, was brief, direct, and would quickly become legendary across the Allied forces: a single word that captured the determination of the defenders in a way no lengthy statement ever could: nuts. That reply was more than battlefield humor, it was a clear signal that Bastogne would continue to resist. For the 77 soldiers holding their sector, the famous exchange did not immediately change their tactical situation. The enemy was still out there, the cold was still biting, and the responsibility to hold their ground remained exactly the same. But morale matters in war, and the knowledge that the larger defensive effort was standing firm across the Bastogne perimeter reinforced the quiet resolve already present among the men on the line. They were not alone in the fight, and the order to hold remained backed by the full determination of the American forces in the sector. As darkness fell once again over the frozen Ardennes, German probing attacks continued in several areas around the Bastogne perimeter, testing the defenses but failing to achieve the kind of decisive breakthrough the offensive required. The 77 Americans maintained their watch through another long winter night, alert to every sound beyond the tree line, fully aware that the enemy still possessed the strength to press harder if an opportunity appeared. Yet hour by hour, something important was happening beyond their immediate view. The German timetable was beginning to slip. Far to the south, elements of the Third Army under the command of George S. Patton were executing one of the most remarkable operational pivots of the war, turning north through difficult winter conditions in a determined effort to relieve the pressure on Bastogne. The movement was still underway and not yet visible to the men holding the line, but the clock was now working against the German offensive in a way it had not been during the first explosive days of the attack. For the 77 soldiers, however, relief was still a distant hope rather than a present reality. Their world remained the frozen ground in front of them, the overlapping fields of fire they had carefully prepared, and the simple, demanding mission they had carried since the offensive began: hold the line and buy time. It was the kind of mission that rarely produces headlines in the moment but often shapes the outcome of far larger battles. In the final part of this story, the pressure around Bastogne will begin to break, the long-awaited relief will push through the Ardennes, and the stand of the 77 soldiers will take its place among the quiet acts of determination that helped turn the tide of the Battle of the Bulge. If you've stayed with this story to this point, take a moment to like the video, subscribe to Voices Across History, and comment, "Never quit," to honor the men who held the line, because in the final chapter, the frozen stand reaches its turning point. By December 22 and into the following days, the battle around Bastogne had settled into a brutal contest of endurance, but something important was beginning to shift beneath the surface of the German offensive. The momentum that had carried the initial surprise attack forward was starting to slow, not because the pressure on the American perimeter had disappeared, but because time, weather, and determined resistance were steadily working against the ambitious timetable that German planners had depended on from the very beginning. For the 77 American soldiers who had been holding their frozen sector through days of mounting tension, the change was subtle at first, measured not in dramatic breakthroughs but in the gradual realization that the enemy's push was no longer accelerating the way it had during those chaotic opening days. The cold remained merciless, and the Bastogne perimeter was still under threat, but the defenders had achieved something critically important: they had bought time, and in large-scale operations, time can be more valuable than territory. Every hour that small units like the 77 had continued to hold their ground forced German forces to expend fuel, ammunition, and momentum that could not easily be replaced under the increasingly strained conditions of the Ardennes winter. The offensive that had been designed as a lightning strike was now becoming a grinding battle of attrition, exactly the kind of fight the German plan had hoped to avoid. Then, slowly but unmistakably, came the development the defenders had been waiting for. From the south, spearheads of the Third Army began pushing north through difficult winter terrain, executing the bold maneuver ordered by George S. Patton in one of the most famous operational turns of the Second World War. The movement was not easy and it was not instant, but it was relentless, and as American armored and infantry elements fought their way toward Bastogne, the strategic pressure on the encircled defenders began to ease. For the 77 soldiers still maintaining their sector, the first clear signs of relief did not arrive with fanfare but with the distant, unmistakable sounds of renewed friendly movement somewhere beyond the frozen tree lines. Artillery patterns began to shift, radio traffic carried a different tone, and the enemy's probing actions, while still dangerous, no longer carried the same confident momentum they had shown earlier in the week. The line had held long enough for the larger response to take shape, and in warfare, that is often the difference between a temporary setback and a lasting breakthrough. When elements of the relieving forces finally broke through to the Bastogne perimeter, it marked one of the most important turning points of the entire Battle of the Bulge. The German attempt to fracture the Allied front had lost its decisive edge, and although heavy fighting would continue across the Ardennes in the weeks that followed, the window for a strategic German victory had effectively closed. Bastogne had not fallen, the road network remained contested but not captured, and the determined resistance of American forces across the sector, including the quiet stand of small groups like the 77 soldiers in our story, had played a real role in blunting the offensive at a critical moment. In the days that followed, the battle would continue, and historians would rightly focus on the large formations, the armored clashes, and the sweeping operational movements that defined the broader campaign. But woven into that larger narrative are the smaller stories that rarely make headlines, the isolated positions held through freezing nights, the disciplined fire control that conserved precious ammunition, and the steady refusal to give ground when the situation grew uncertain. The 77 American soldiers who held their line in the frozen Ardennes represent exactly that kind of quiet battlefield determination, the kind that rarely seeks attention but often shapes outcomes in ways that only become clear with time. Their stand was not about dramatic last stands or cinematic heroics, it was about something more fundamental to military history: discipline under pressure, cohesion in the face of uncertainty, and the willingness of ordinary soldiers to carry out their mission even when the larger situation around them appears to be shifting in dangerous ways. In the harsh winter of 1944, in the forests around Bastogne, that kind of resolve helped ensure that the German offensive would not achieve the decisive breakthrough it so desperately needed. Today, the Battle of the Bulge is remembered as one of the most important and costly battles fought by American forces in Europe, and while the grand movements of armies dominate the history books, it is worth remembering that the outcome of great battles is often decided in places where only a few dozen soldiers are holding a stretch of frozen ground and refusing to yield it. The 77 men in this story were part of that larger tapestry of resistance, and their steady stand remains a powerful reminder of how determination at the smallest unit level can echo across the broader sweep of history. If this story gave you a new appreciation for the men who fought in the Ardennes, take a moment to like the video, subscribe to Voices Across History, and share this with someone who respects military history. And before you go, drop a comment with the word "remember," because honoring stories like this is exactly why this channel exists. Until next time, stay curious, stay respectful of history, and we'll see you in the next story.